Hi guys, we've got another video talking about historical documents. So we're going to be talking about Japan, but this time seen through the eyes of Europeans. So it's almost a meeting of the two worlds. We're going to be looking at a series of passages describing Japan as seen by a Portuguese missionary named Luís Fróis, um, from the late 16th century, so around 1585 or so. Before I get into it, I want to thank in particular Gunsen from Gunbai Military History. He's helped me a lot in this research, so shout out to my buddy Gunsen. You'll see a lot of references that he helped me find. So this is an English translation that I'm reading from called The First European Description of Japan, 1585. And let's get right into it. So these are the perspectives of this one Portuguese missionary looking at Japan before the peaceful Edo period. So this is at the end of the Sengoku Jidai. And it's a huge long book, a huge long account, but since I'm a sword nerd, we're going to look at it in so much as the accounts describe the swords. Now, again, two takeaways. One, he's looking at it from the perspective of a European, and there's two halves to that. One, he's going to be biased, looking at it from a European biased perspective. So he's going to perhaps look down on some things or look up on some things. I always like to see an outsider's perspective because sometimes that gives a very candid view of what's actually going on. For instance, if we wanted to know if the conquistadors used a piece of equipment, let's say shields, and we have an account from the native population in Mesoamerica at the time, and it says they used shields, that's a very fair way to determine whether or not that occurred, for example. So sometimes I like to see an outsider's perspective, but again, it's not infallible and it certainly is biased. So keep that in mind while we're reading these things. These are a European's perspective on the Japanese, and they're going to be different than if we're reading Japanese accounts of the same period. Okay, so first passage in describing the overall appearance of how the Japanese conduct themselves. Um, we, the Europeans, use a double-edged sword. The Japanese uses a cutlass. It's got an author's note here. I don't know if I can find where it leads, but there's obviously a word in Portuguese for cutlass. The Japanese, use a cutlass that has only a single edge. No surprise there. Our scabbards are made of leather or velvet. The Japanese use lacquered wood, except their nobles, whose scabbards are covered with gold or silver. So pointing out that the majority of them have very simple saya. So I'll bring my visual aid down. So at the time, again, the saya are wood with a lacquered covering to keep the elements off of it, but the more high-end ones apparently could be gold or silver covered. Our swords have chapes, hilts, and pommels. Japanese swords have none of these. So a chape, again, protecting the very bottom of the scabbard. And then they say hilts and pommels. Now, depending on the type of sword, you can sometimes get a kashira, and obviously many of the swords do have a type of cross, if you want to call that a hilt. But in this period, as we'll see from some of the period artwork, a lot of the swords didn't even have the suba, didn't even have the disc guard. So that's an observation that he's making, and an important one. Our swords are tested on lumber or animals. Something interesting. So oftentimes the question is asked, did European makers do anything with their swords? Well, was test cutting even done in the European context? Well, in the 15th century, apparently one of the things they did was test them on wood, lumber it says, and animals. The Japanese insist upon testing their swords on human corpses. So this goes back to the old Tamashigiri. We touched on this a little bit in the last video. It was considered something that was done on swords, where we can still read the inscriptions on the Nakago. For many blades were tested, at least very high quality blades were tested on the bodies of criminals, on condemned criminals. Our cutlasses or scimitars are worn with the convex side downwards. The Japanese wear theirs with the convex side up and the concave side down. So it's just talking about how at this point they'd already transitioned to wearing the uchikatana with the edge upward, and talking about how if they wore they use the word scimitar, so getting into the age of having things like dusak, um, uh, cutlass, storta, other types of European single-edged short saber, they would wear them hanging from a belt, suspended, edge down, much like a Japanese tachi. Among us, a man can reach the age of 20 and still not carry a sword. That's something to note. So, among in the high Middle Ages, if you were a knight, you would start your training from the age of childhood. But by the 16th century, they were moving to hired military, to more of a um, not, if not conscripted, but a professional military sort of setting. And at this point, it looked like you could become a man before you started your formal service in working in the military and having a sword. In Japan, 12 and 13-year-old boys carry a sword and daggers. So the katana and the tanto. Okay, this section is now talking specifically about warfare, so some of this may rehash things we've heard before. 1. We use swords. The Japanese use cutlass or cutlasses. As established before, they're distinguishing between double-edged swords. At this point, we're talking about side swords and rapiers, and they're saying that katana are closer to what the Portuguese would recognize as a cutlass. The handle of our swords fits the size of our hand. Theirs is over 1 span in length, sometimes up to 3 spans in length. So they're talking about how long the suka is. And again, we've talked about this before in comparing a similar length, even longsword. If a Japanese sword is the same length as a longsword, the Japanese sword usually will have a longer hilt than a comparable size European longsword. Our men carry their swords in baldricks. Their men have a hook on their sash. So talking about the way that they attach the sword to their obi. Our men wear a sword on one side and a dagger on the other. Okay, so your parrying dagger is on your right and your main sword is on your left. The Japanese always wear their sword and dagger on the left. So again, the daisho is worn with both on the left side of the obi. Our daggers are short, relatively short. And I've seen some pretty big parrying daggers, but let's hear about the contrasts. Some of theirs are more than half of the length of their cutlass. So, not sure exactly what he refers to as a dagger here. He may be confusing the tanto with the wakizashi. If he's talking about a wakizashi and he considers that the companion blade, then yeah, that's going to be much bigger than any fencing dagger in most cases, because it's effectively a short sword. On our swords, we hang our gloves. That's something I haven't really seen depicted before. I guess they put them on the end of the hilt. They hang a cord that serves no purpose. so they consider this to be purposeless, even though it's a retention cord. It's worth noting that the sageo was mostly not used at this time. So in earlier times, it would have been used as a retention knot. So at this point, it was largely ceremonial. The people of Europe are accustomed to thrusting during sword fights. The Japanese never do so. So this is about as close as we're going to get discussing a rapier versus a katana. This observer has obviously seen at least some of the kenjutsu going on in Japan. And again, it's worth noting that he was stationed mostly in Kyushu, so perhaps not on Honshu proper, but he's still in a position where he's seen some of the sword fighting that's going on. and he's noticing a large distinction between how the Japanese are conducting their swordplay and how the Europeans are conducting their swordplay. And at this point, between rapier and side sword and the style of swordsmanship where you have a very point-centric type of fencing going on, the Japanese are apparently not practicing the use of that point nearly as much. And even though he's not talking about an actual clash between East versus West, he points out that there is a distinct difference in how the two types of swordsmanship distinguish themselves. Next, among us, swords of good quality iron are given to lords as gifts. In Japan, they give them wooden swords with scabbards made of cloth. This is kind of funny because this is referring to kidachi, which are kind of short little wooden swords that were in fact given as kind of ceremonial gifts. We place nothing more than a sword in our scabbards. The Japanese place a knife in one side of theirs, and on the other side, a kogai that serves no purpose. So he didn't know what the little kogai served. So by this point, a kogai served almost no purpose. In the Heian period, it had been used to either scratch your scalp or help get your hair put in under your helmet. By this point, it was largely, again, just retained for ceremonial purposes. I don't know of any Muromachi or Edo period accounts of it having a functional use for a samurai. I know later some women adopted them as hairpins, but by this period, it just continued being put on the swords for convention's sake. Next, if our swords are of high quality, they are very costly, even when brand new. And again, by the 16th century, they were making very, very gaudy, very ornate swords in Europe. In Japan, the new ones have no value, and it is only very old swords that are expensive. So even today, obviously, there is great attention to detail in the Nihonto collection circles about some of the most famous smiths and the best swords being from certain periods in Japan's history. That was no different then, and it's interesting that he points out that despite their best efforts in the late Muromachi period, that the swords that came from a famous history with a lot of legends and accolades with them were the ones that were considered perhaps tested and more well respected than a brand new sword that was hot off of the anvil. Next, among us, one carries at most one sword and one dagger. The Japanese sometimes wear two swords and a wakizashi on their belt. So this is talking, he at this point specifies a wakizashi, and he's suggesting that there are multiple swords. So it's unclear if he's saying uchikatana, wakizashi, tanto, or if he's saying tachi, uchikatana, wakizashi, or if he's saying something even bigger. They have seoidachi or nodachi. Sometimes you would find back-worn swords, and then your daisho pair as well. But here is one author who makes it a point of saying that sometimes people would wear up to 3 swords at a time when they're going out and about. Let's see, what else do we have? We use halberds. They use naginata shaped like a sickle. So a point that the naginata are very curved compared to the halberds that they have. This one isn't related to swords, but I'd just like to point out also. Among us, no one utters a sound when shooting a bow. The Japanese let out a big cry when they released the arrow. And I find this interesting. As someone who's practiced Koryu arts before, the concept behind the kiai, or the shouting when you are releasing especially a temiwaza, is very familiar for anyone who's practiced any type of Japanese art. And that's true for Kyudo, the archery as well. I've never practiced Kyudo, but I've seen it done before. But it's interesting that he specifies that European archers, without making any noise, and yet among Japanese archery, ha! You release a large sound whenever you do your loosing your shot. Among us, we use shields, including gilt rondelles, oval leather shields, and oval leather shields. The Japanese use flat wooden shields that resemble doors. So there's a lot of discussion of, do Japanese use shields? Do they not? A lot of people will say that during lots of Japanese history, shield use was almost non-existent or was unnecessary, especially among samurai who perhaps, in order to perform archery, couldn't afford one hand to use a shield, and so the sode of their armor instead served as shields. There are depictions of kind of pavis-like standing shields, more like fortifications, which they'd sit behind and shoot from. This account, I do not believe, describes that. This instead does discuss the use of a hand shield, a wooden hand shield, this kind of square, and is something that we do see in art, perhaps not as often as you would find them in European military art of the time, but it is something that was used on the battlefield in Japan. So one more description and one more thing to think about when we talk about these encounters between Japanese forces and other non-Japanese forces. Another interesting point I'd like to point out here. It says, our armor is very heavy. Japanese armor is very light. So I know Metatron has done many comparisons between Japanese configurations of armor and European configurations of armor. And again, Luis here is perhaps giving his impressions of what a European configuration is. I'm going to show some examples of armor that may have been seen at the time by the infantry, the Ashiguro, that he would have been looking at in either Kyushu or Kansai that Gunsen has shared with me. So the configurations of armor may not have been the heaviest configurations that you would see as worn by the highest ranking members of the military at this time. So as again my buddy Gunsen pointed out, the armor seen in the eastern regions was perhaps heavier configuration. So there's going to be a spectrum in Japan, just like there's a spectrum of army in Europe. It wouldn't be fair to compare an archer to a heavy horseman, a heavy dressed cavalier, for example. And finally, the last account relates to the topic at hand. Europeans kill wild boars with spears, guns, and hounds. The Japanese often beat the woods to drive them out so that they can kill them with swords. So, a fun little foray into the topic of what was going on in Japan in the 16th century. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe we learned something. I'll continue to look at records that can help share insight into both what was going on in Europe and in Japan and China and all sorts of other places. And if we learn a little bit more about swords along the way, then all the better for it. Until next time, guys, take care.